When looking at the militaries of the ancient world, such as the legions of the Roman Republic or the phalanxes of Alexander the Great, the numbers are staggering, with armies numbering in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands. However, centuries later in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, armies had become significantly smaller, counting in a few thousand at most. Why did the scale of warfare shrink so drastically between antiquity and the medieval era? In this video, we will explore the various answers to this question. Estimating the exact numbers of soldiers different armies were composed of in the past is rarely easy, as these numbers are given to us by chroniclers and historians from centuries past, who can often be misleading. They would either boast or reduce numbers to make a victory seem even more majestic, or a loss to be more easily digestible and less catastrophic, depending on what the one who recounts the battle wants to convey. Even once one arrives at a good estimation based on historical sources, it is still hard to distinguish official combatants from non-combatants accompanying the army, whether they were there for logistic support, such as porters and cooks, or as freebooters in search of loot and fortune. Having premised these elements, we will now tackle the main question. Why do the armies of the medieval era seem so small when compared to the armies of the empires of the classical era? During the Second Persian invasion of Greece, when King Xerxes' army defeated the Spartan-led Greek army at Thermopylae, modern historians believe that the Persian King of Kings was accompanied by around 100,000 soldiers, a very sizable army for its time, though still less than the unrealistic 2.5 million claimed by the Greek historian Herodotus, who, like many other sources of the classical era, greatly inflated the numbers of armies up to ridiculous figures. Some 400 years later, at the Battle of Philippi, fought between the second triumvirate of Mark Antony and Octavian and Caesar's assassins, modern historians believe that both sides fielded legions numbering around 60,000 to 80,000 men. Even as late as the end of the 4th century, the Roman Empire under Julian the Apostate invaded the Persian Empire with an army of over 60,000 troops, backed by an incredible feat of logistics to keep the force going. Let us now compare these numbers specifically to the armies fielded by the kings of Western Europe in the Middle Ages. For example, at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, Philip II, King of France, managed to raise around 6,500 men against Emperor Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire, who brought with him 9,000 men. During the 100 Years' War, the English armies that attacked France usually numbered around 10,000 men, and often half that when they were not accompanied by a prince, while the French Royal Army managed to muster around 20,000 men a few times, but usually had fewer. Of course, in both of these examples, we are not seeing the sum total of all the military forces available to those kingdoms, and different elements limited the number of total troops that could be brought on the battlefield. The French king Philip II had to leave a third of his men to his son to confront an English expedition elsewhere, while during the 100 Years' War, the Plantagenet monarchs were often hampered by shipping capacity. Still, overall, we can see a distinct decrease in medieval army size when compared to their ancient forebears. To partially explain this, firstly we need to remember that to raise, pay, and supply an army, a ruler needs the financial and material backing from the state he governs. Here we can see the first difference between the ancient and medieval worlds. The empires of antiquity were both geographically larger and more populated than the kingdoms of the Middle Ages, able to draw resources and manpower from a larger pool, and governed by an efficient bureaucracy based on centuries of governmental evolution. Bigger empires and resources also meant better transportation networks for the purposes of communication, logistics, and internal movement. This allowed easier mobilization over greater regions, as troops could be moved and fed with greater ease. The Roman Empire at its height is estimated to have had a standing army of 400,000 men, but these were distributed throughout its many different provinces and locally supplied from them. Meanwhile, medieval Europe was more politically fractured and less centralized than ancient Rome ever was, as Germanic migrations split up the western half of the erstwhile empire into a handful of smaller kingdoms. In the 9th century, after a brief revival of a more centralized administration brought about by the Carolingian dynasty, the dissolution of the Carolingians gave rise to the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire, both states which featured a landholding aristocracy that was broadly autonomous from, and often even in conflict with, the royal central power. Overall, medieval states were also just geographically smaller in comparison to their ancient counterparts, while the central government was generally weaker, save for a few exceptions during Charlemagne's reign, or a few localized attempts like the Kingdom of Naples. This meant fewer resources and fewer troops. While the High and Late Middle Ages are generally well attested to, estimating the size of armies in the early Middle Ages is extremely hard, as sources from this period are scarce and extremely unreliable. Various chronicles mention how during this era, hosts as small as 100 men could cause significant damage in some regions, as rural settlements were small. Ottonian sources from the 10th century mention 50 slaughtered knights as an enormous setback, indicating that entire armies at the time probably numbered in the low thousands. As for the total number of raisable troops, we have documents claiming that the Ottonian Empire could raise 20,000 armed saddled men, while another document from the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Wessex has been used to extrapolate a field army of around 5,500. However, historians point out that these numbers were, in fact, just theoretical strengths on paper, and that the actual numbers were probably lower. Other academics have attempted to extrapolate numbers by looking at what the economy of Western Europe could sustain at a time. Following the 6th century, Europe had fallen into a general economic depression, particularly in northern Gaul and Brittany, as towns declined and large swaths of terrain were abandoned. As a result, settlements were small, so an army of, say, 5,000 men could represent many times the size of a town in an area, and the presence of such a force in such a relatively depopulated region could be devastating, as the soldiers would forage an area to sustain themselves, which usually meant squeezing food and supplies from the already sparse local peasantry. I hope you enjoyed this video about why medieval armies were so small. If you enjoyed this video, do like this video and subscribe to my channel Medieval Mind for more videos about Middle Ages like this. Thank you.